There is a man in a library who has not eaten today. Not because he forgot, not because he couldn't afford to. Because somewhere in his calculation of what a human being deserves, comfort didn't make the list. He sleeps on a trunk, he gives his salary away. He wears the same clothes until they fall apart, and when someone gives him a coat, he finds someone colder and gives it to them too. This is not a saint. Saints have already made their peace. This man is at war. His name is Nikolai Fedorov, and he decided, quietly, systematically, and without apology, that death is a problem to be solved. Not transcended, not accepted, not mourned with flowers and philosophy and the comfortable lies we tell each other at funerals. Solved like an engineering challenge. Like the kind of problem that only stays unsolved because we decided at some point that solving it was arrogant. That death deserved our respect. Federov thought that was the most dangerous idea humanity ever had. Look around you. We have built an entire civilization on the premise that people die and that this is fine. We build museums to house their objects. We build libraries to house their thoughts. We build cemeteries and cathedrals, and we call this honoring the dead. And Fedorov, this quiet librarian surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of everyone who no longer exists, looked at all of it and said, "This is not honor. This is a very elaborate way of doing nothing." He called it the common task, the literal, physical, scientific resurrection of every human being who has ever lived. Not as metaphor, not as theology, as a project, as a moral obligation, as the only thing a civilization worthy of the name should be working toward. Tolstoy was shaken by him, Dostoevsky was shaken by him, and these were not men who shook easily. Here is what this episode is going to do to you. It's going to make you sit with the possibility that your acceptance of death, your mature, philosophical, hard-won peace with mortality, is not wisdom, it is not grace, it is collaboration. It is the same quiet surrender that keeps every unjust system intact. The moment you decide something is inevitable, you stop being responsible for it. Fedorov never stopped being responsible for it. He was born illegitimate, the son of a prince who would not name him and a serf woman who was property. He spent his life surrounded by the thoughts of the dead, cataloguing them, preserving them, watching scholars come and go and treat those thoughts as sufficient substitute for the people themselves. He disagreed. He died in 1903 of pneumonia, having refused a coat. The man who spent his life arguing with death lost the argument, the way all of us eventually lose the argument. But he never stopped making it. And that, he would tell you, is the whole point. Being born illegitimate in 19th century Russia means your father is a prince and your mother is a serf. And the distance between those two facts is not measured in miles or rubles or social standing. It is measured in whether or not you exist, officially, legally, in the eyes of a civilization that has decided your existence is an inconvenience to be managed rather than a life to be acknowledged. Nikolai Fedorov was born in 1829. His father was Prince Pavel Ivanovich Gagarin. His mother was a woman whose name history has largely failed to preserve, which is itself a kind of answer to every question Fedorov would spend his life asking. She was a serf, she was property, and the child she had with a man who owned people like her was given a surname, Fedorov. That was not his father's name and not his mother's name, but the name of his godfather, a placeholder name, an administrative solution to the problem of his existence. This is where the philosophy begins, in the specific, personal, visceral experience of being a person whose father looked at him and decided, "You do not get to carry my name, you do not get to be continuous with me, you will exist, but you will exist as a gap, as an absence." You want to understand why a man dedicates his life to the resurrection of the dead, to the insistence that every human being who has ever lived deserves to be returned, to be restored, to be given back the existence that was taken from them. We start here, with a boy who understood from the beginning that existence itself can be revoked, that the people with power decide who gets to be real and who gets to be erased, that civilization is very comfortable with erasure, as long as it's done quietly and given a different name. Fedorov was not comfortable with it. He was educated remarkably at the Odessa Richelieu Lyceum, educated enough to become a teacher, which he did for over a decade, moving through various provincial towns, teaching history and geography to children in schools that had almost nothing. He was, by all accounts, extraordinary at it. He gave his students not just facts, but frameworks. He taught history the way a man teaches history when he believes the past is not past, when he believes the dead are still present, still owed something, still waiting. But teaching was not enough. Nothing was ever going to be enough until he found the right library. In 1874, Fedorov became a cataloger at the Rumyantsev Museum in Moscow, and I'm going to apologize for all pronunciations here, past and present and future, which housed one of the great libraries of Russia. He would stay for 25 years, and here is where the man and the philosophy become indistinguishable from each other, because a library is already a philosophy. A library is already an argument about what we owe the dead. Think about what a library actually is. It's a building full of the thoughts of people who no longer exist. Every book on every shelf is a dead person still trying to talk, still trying to reach across the silence and make contact with someone alive. The library is humanity's most sustained and serious attempt to defeat death, to preserve something essential of a person after their body is gone. Fedorov saw this clearly. He honoured it. He devoted himself to it with the same radical seriousness he devoted to everything. He was legendarily good at his job. Scholars came from across Russia and he could find anything, remember anything, connect any reader with exactly what they needed. He didn't just catalogue the collection, he inhabited it. He became the living index of a library full of the dead. And then, quietly, in the hours between other people's requests, he began to develop his argument, which was this. The library is noble, and the library is insufficient, and the library is, at its core, a monument to our surrender. We preserve the thoughts of the dead because we have accepted that the dead themselves are gone forever. We keep the echo because we've given up on the voice. We frame this as reverence. Fedorov called it resignation dressed in expensive binding. The poverty was not incidental to this. The poverty was the argument made physical. Fedorov lived on almost nothing. He slept on a trunk in a small room. He ate bread, maybe tea. When the museum paid him, he gave the money away to students, to beggars, to anyone whose needs seemed more immediate than his own. When colleagues gave him food, he often refused it. When someone gave him a coat, he found someone who needed it more. This was not performance. This was not the calculated asceticism of a man who wanted to be seen as holy. This was a man who had done the math and arrived at an answer that most of us refuse to calculate. The math goes like this. Billions of human beings have lived and suffered and died. Every luxury you consume is a choice made in a context of that suffering. Every comfort you accept is a negotiation with a civilization built on the bodies of people who had no comfort at all. Fedorov looked at that equation and decided that personal comfort was a form of collaboration, a way of saying, I accept this world, I accept the terms, I accept that people suffer and die and that my job is to be comfortable within that framework rather than to dismantle the framework itself. He would not accept those terms. And in doing so, he becomes very difficult to argue with because every argument you make in favour of reasonable comfort and reasonable compromise, he already knows that argument. He made it to himself and he found it wanting. Not because it isn't logical, but because it isn't serious. Because it's the argument of a person who's decided at some level that the way things are is close enough to the way things should be. Fedorov had been told since birth that the way things are was acceptable. His father had told him that structurally by refusing to name him. Russian society had told him that by having a category called illegitimate that meant your existence is a problem we have to administratively resolve. He knew what it felt like to have civilization tell you that your erasure was reasonable, and he spent the rest of his life disagreeing. This is the man that Tolstoy came to the library to see. This is the man that shook Dostoevsky's disciples badly enough that you can feel the reverberations in the brothers Karamazov, in Father Zosima's insistence on universal responsibility, on the idea that we are all responsible for everyone and everything. This is the man who slept on a trunk surrounded by the thoughts of the dead and decided that thoughts were not enough. The illegitimate son of a prince who would not name him looked at civilization that had made peace with death and recognized the gesture. He had seen it before. It was the same gesture his father made when he looked at a child and decided, you do not get to exist fully. You do not get to be returned to. You do not get to be part of what continues. Every single one of us, Fedorov said, gets to be returned to. Every single one of us gets to continue, whether the universe likes it or not. Libraries are not temples to knowledge. They are not celebrations of human achievement. They are not the monuments to progress that the architecture wants you to believe. All those high ceilings, all that light coming through tall windows, the hushed reverence that feels like worship but is actually something closer to grief. A library is a collection of last words. Every book on every shelf is a person who is gone, trying not to be gone. Every page is a hand reaching through the dirt. Every sentence is someone saying, I was here, I thought this, I felt this, please, and this is the part we don't say out loud, please don't let me disappear completely. Fedorov understood this, and he understood it the way that you only understand something when you've spent 25 years inside it, when you've run your hand along 10,000 spines and memorized 10,000 names of people who no longer exist anywhere, except in the words they left behind. He understood it the way the illegitimate son of a man who refused to name him understands what it means to almost not exist, to be preserved in a diminished form, to be kept as record rather than returned as person. The Rumyantsev Museum Library in Moscow was one of the greatest collections of 19th century Russia. Tolstoy came there, Dostoevsky's circle came there, Solovyov came there. The greatest minds of Russian intellectual life walked through those doors, and they came, many of them, specifically to find Fedorov, this small, thin, ascetic man who slept on a trunk and gave his salary away and who could find anything, knew everything, and who would, if you asked him the right question, sit with you and talk until the building closed and the night came in through the windows and you walked home feeling like the ground had shifted slightly under your feet. Tolstoy came back more than once. That is the detail that matters. A man like Tolstoy, who had his own enormous gravitational field, his own complete philosophical universe, he came back because Fedorov kept asking something that Tolstoy's answers couldn't quite reach. What do we owe the dead? Not as sentiment, not as a kind of question you ask at a funeral and answer with flowers and silence, as a serious moral and philosophical and eventually scientific question. What is the actual content of our obligation to the people who are gone? Is memory sufficient? Is preservation of their ideas sufficient? Is naming a building after them or putting their face on a mountain or teaching their work in universities, is any of that sufficient? Fedorov's answer developed slowly in the hours between other people's requests, surrounded by the accumulated last words of the dead, was no. None of it is sufficient. All of it is consolation prize. All of it is the civilization's way of saying, we couldn't keep you, so we kept this instead, and we hope that's enough. And we prefer not to discuss whether it's enough because the discussion makes us uncomfortable. Fedorov was not uncomfortable, except when he's on that trunk, of course, and the library for Fedorov was the place where the insufficiency was most visible, because a library is humanity's most serious attempt at this problem, and a library is still just words. It's still just the echo. The voice is gone, and we've built these enormous, beautiful buildings to house the echo, and we call them cathedrals of knowledge. And we feel good about ourselves for funding them and visiting them and taking our children to them. Fedorov felt the tragedy of them. He felt it the way you feel a wound that everyone else has agreed to call a feature. The library is impressive, yes. The library is valuable, yes. The library is also evidence, exhibit after exhibit after exhibit of how many people are gone and how little we have actually done about it. This is the philosophical move that separates Fedorov from every other thinker who has grappled with morality. Most philosophy, when it confronts death, eventually arrives at acceptance. The Stoics arrive at acceptance. The Buddhists arrive at acceptance. Even the existentialists who make such a performance of confronting death without flinching arrive at a kind of acceptance. Death gives life meaning. Death is what makes your choices matter. Death is the horizon that makes the landscape visible. They dress the acceptance in different clothes, but it is still acceptance. It's still the mind finding a way to be at peace with the way things are. Fedorov would not find a way to be at peace with the way things are. He had spent too long watching the way things are up close. He'd read too many last words, catalogued too many final attempts by too many dead minds to stay present in a world that had already moved on without them. The library is a cathedral, he understood, but it is a cathedral built to house our defeat. The high ceilings are not triumphant, they are elegaic. The hushed reverence is not worship, it is mourning that has learned to hold itself upright. Fedorov decided the cathedral needed to be repurposed. Not a monument to the defeat of the dead, a laboratory for their return. The knowledge preserved in those books, the science, the philosophy, the history, the accumulated understanding of how matter works and how consciousness works and how the physical world operates, all of that existed, Fedorov believed, as the raw material for the common task. Humanity had spent millennia writing down everything it learned. It had built these vast repositories of understanding, and it was using all of that understanding for what, exactly? For comfort, for convenience, for the construction of better weapons and faster transport and more efficient ways of organizing economic activity. He thought that was a waste so profound it constituted a moral failure. The knowledge exists. The question is what we point it at. And Fedorov, surrounded by 25 years of accumulated human understanding, pointed it at the only problem that actually mattered. The problem that every person in every book on every shelf had personally experienced and personally failed to solve. Death. Not as metaphor, not as the subject of poetry or religious consolation, as an engineering problem, as the problem, the one that makes every other problem either preliminary or irrelevant. When Vladimir Solovyov, Russia's most celebrated philosopher of the period, a man who called Fedorov his teacher and father, when Solovyov engaged with these ideas, he did not laugh, he did not dismiss. He wrote about them with the utmost seriousness, as though he'd encountered something that could not be unfelt, something that once you understand it, made every other philosophical project look like a distraction from the main event. The main event was always the dead. The library knew this. Every book in every library knows this. Every last word ever written knows this because every last word ever written is the same last word, underneath whatever else it's saying. I was here. Bring me back. Fedorov was the only one who wrote that down as an instruction rather than a plea. The only one who looked at all those reaching hands and said, this is not a cry to be witnessed, this is a task to be completed. The library was never the destination, it was always the blueprint. Let's talk about what Fedorov actually believed. Not the poetic version, not the version that's easy to hold at arm's length and admire as a beautiful, tragic, impossible idea. The literal version. The version that made Tolstoy go quiet and made Solovyov call him father, and made everyone who encountered it feel like the floor had become slightly less reliable under their feet. Fedorov believed that humanity's singular moral obligation, the only project worthy of the name civilization, was the literal, physical resurrection of every human being who has ever lived. Not every human being alive now, every human being ever. The peasant who died of plague in 14th century Novgorod. The child who didn't survive her first winter in a village whose name no one remembers. The soldier who bled out in a field that is now a parking lot. The slave whose name was never recorded because recording it seemed unnecessary. Every person who ever drew breath and then stopped drawing breath. Every person that death has ever taken. Which is to say, every person. All of them. Back in their bodies, alive. This is the common task. This is what Fedorov meant when he used that phrase, not a metaphor for social progress or poetic shorthand for human solidarity. It's not the kind of vague aspirational language that philosophy uses when it wants to gesture at something important without committing to anything specific. A task, concrete, assigned, non-negotiable. And here's the first part you need to understand about it. The science was not the hard part for Fedorov. The hard part was the moral architecture. Because Fedorov understood something that our current generation of death-defying technological billionaires has largely failed to grasp. You cannot resurrect the dead in a world that is still organized around competition, accumulation, and the willingness to sacrifice other people for personal advantage. The project is logically incompatible with the civilization we've built. Think about what the common task actually requires. It requires that every human being alive redirect their energy, their intelligence, their resources, and their ambition toward a single collective project. Not toward national advantage, not toward personal wealth, or the kind of fragmented, competitive, zero-sum striving that organizes almost every human institution currently in existence, toward one thing, together. This means the common task is not just a scientific program, it is a political revolution. It's a spiritual transformation. It's the most demanding collective project ever proposed because it does not allow for partial participation. You cannot do the common task while also running an empire. You cannot do the common task while also fighting a war. And you can't do it whilst you're also organizing a civilization around the principle that some people matter more than others. Because the entire point of the common task is that every person who has ever lived matters equally, unconditionally, without exception. This is where Fedorov's illegitimate birth bleeds into his philosophical foundation. The man who was told his existence was conditional, that he mattered less because of the circumstances of his birth, built a philosophy in which no existence is ever conditional, in which the circumstances of your birth, your death, your social position, your historical moment, your race, your class, your name or lack thereof, do not determine whether you deserve to be returned to life. Everyone deserves to be returned. The common task admits no hierarchy. Now let's talk about the science, because Fedorov was not vague about it. He believed that the particles that once constituted a human body do not disappear. They disperse. They become part of the soil, the water, the atmosphere. They move through other organisms and other systems, but they persist because matter persists. The atoms that made your great-great-grandmother are still somewhere in the physical universe, scattered, rearranged, incorporated into other forms, but present. Fedorov believed that the development of sufficient scientific and technological capacity would eventually allow humanity to locate those particles, to understand how they were once organized, and to reconstruct the body they once constituted. This sounds to the contemporary ear somewhere between visionary and deranged, but sit with it before you dismiss it. The assumption underneath it, that matter is conserved, that information about physical organization might in principle be recoverable, that the boundary between dead and alive is a technical problem rather than an ontological one, these assumptions are not obviously wrong. They are in fact the assumptions that drive significant portions of contemporary physics, information theory, and the kind of longevity research that serious scientists conduct with serious funding at serious institutions right now in the 21st century. Fedorov was working in the 1870s and 80s without a laboratory, without colleagues who took him seriously in any institutional sense, in a library, on his lunch break, having not eaten. He also understood something else. Earth would not be sufficient. If you resurrect every human being who has ever lived, you need somewhere to put them. The planet cannot hold the accumulated dead of all of human history alongside the living. This means the common task requires the mastery of space. It requires humanity to become a spacefaring civilization, not for the reasons we typically give for space exploration, like resources or adventure, or the romantic notion of humanity's destiny among the stars. For housing, for the practical, logistical requirement of having somewhere for the returned dead to live. This isn't a metaphor either. Fedorov drew the direct line from the obligation to resurrect to the necessity of cosmic expansion. And Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the man who essentially founded astronautics, who developed the theoretical basis for rocket propulsion, Tsiolkovsky was Fedorov's direct disciple. He sat with Fedorov in Moscow, he absorbed the common task, and then he spent his life working out the mathematics of how to leave the planet. The Soviet space program had cosmism in its bones. The ideology that put Sputnik in orbit and Gagarin in a capsule was not purely materialist communist ambition. It was Fedorovian. It was the dream of a librarian who slept on a trunk and gave his coat away, transmitted through decades of Russian intellectual life into the engineering programs of the USSR. The rocket was, in the deepest sense, a resurrection machine, a vehicle for getting to the place where the returned dead would live. Now, you're entirely allowed to find this insane. Fedorov would not argue with you about whether it sounds insane. He would ask you a different question. He would ask you, what's your alternative? What is the project you are proposing instead? What are you pointing civilization's accumulated knowledge and capacity at, if not this? What problem are you solving that is more serious than the problem that every person who has ever loved someone has personally experienced as the worst thing that existence contains? You are going to die. Everyone you love is going to die. Everyone who has ever lived has died except the people alive right now, and they are busy working on it. Fedorov looked at that fact and refused to call it natural, refused to call it inevitable. He refused to perform the philosophical maneuver that every other thinker performs at this point, which is to find a way to mean something other than what you say, to make death into a teacher, to make loss into a gift, to make the silence of the grave into something you can live with. He could not live with it. He would not live with it. And so he proposed in a library in Moscow, surrounded by the last words of the dead, the only response to death that does not at its core involve giving up. Bring them back. All of them. God and death made a deal, and the deal goes like this. I will accept that death is real. I will accept that the people I love will disappear from this world and I will not see them again in any form I can touch or speak to or verify. I will accept that I myself will disappear. And in exchange for this acceptance, you, God, universe, the story I tell myself in the quiet hours, you will give me the promise that it isn't really the end, that there is something after, that the disappearance is not a disappearance but a transition, a door rather than a wall. Every major religion is a variation on this deal. The details differ. The afterlife looks different depending on which tradition you're standing in, but the structure is identical everywhere you look. Accept death, receive consolation, move on with your life in the knowledge that moving on is not abandonment because the dead have moved on too, into something better, into something beyond your ability to verify, but also beyond your ability to disprove. Now, Fedorov didn't like this idea, not because he didn't believe in God. He did. He was Russian Orthodox, formed by its liturgy, shaped by its theology, genuinely committed to its central claims. He believed in Christ, he believed in the resurrection, and that belief, rather than giving him peace with death, made his war with death more total, more serious, more uncompromising than anything a purely secular philosophy could have generated. Because if Christ rose from the dead, like actually physically rose, walked out of that tomb in a body that could be touched and fed and recognized, then resurrection is not a metaphor. It is a demonstration. It is God showing humanity what is possible. It is the proof of concept. And a proof of concept is not a gift, it's an assignment. This is the move that makes Fedorov genuinely dangerous to every comfortable religious position, to every theology that has made its peace with death by relocating the resurrection to the afterlife and removing it from human responsibility. He reads the resurrection of Christ and arrives at a conclusion that almost no one else in the history of Christian thought has been willing to arrive at. The resurrection is something humanity is supposed to do. That the miracle was not the point. The miracle was the instruction. God in Fedorov's theology does not save passively. God does not reach down and fix what humanity has broken. God demonstrates what fixing looks like and then steps back and waits to see whether humanity has the moral seriousness to attempt it. Prayer without action is not piety. It is cowardice that has learned to kneel. It is the spiritual equivalent of watching someone drown while asking God to save them instead of jumping in yourself. And he was not gentle about this. The Russian Orthodox tradition he inhabited was in many ways perfectly suited to generate this conclusion. Russian Orthodoxy has always had a more embodied, more physical, more this-worldly dimension than Western Christianity. The icons are not symbols. The Eucharist is not metaphor. The body matters in Russian Orthodox theology in ways that Protestant theology has largely moved away from. Fedorov took that embodied seriousness and followed it to its logical end, which was, if the body matters, then the death of the body is not a minor inconvenience on the way to spiritual liberation. It is a catastrophe. It's the catastrophe. And treating it as anything less is a failure of theological nerve. Tolstoy understood the force of this and couldn't accept it. Their relationship is one of the most philosophically charged encounters in 19th century Russian intellectual life, and it is charged precisely because they agreed about almost everything except the thing that mattered most. Both believed in radical moral seriousness. Both believed in the obligation to live according to your principles rather than your comfort. And both believed that civilization had made catastrophic compromises with injustice, and that the task of serious people was to refuse those compromises. But Tolstoy's ethics were this worldly. Tolstoy wanted to fix the living. He wanted land reform and non-violence, and the dismantling of the structures that ground ordinary people into poverty and submission. He looked at Fedorov's common task and said, "This is a fantasy that distracts from the present obligations we have to the people who are suffering right now, in bodies that still have time to be saved." Fedorov wasn't gentle about this either. He looked at Tolstoy's this worldly ethics and said, "You have accepted the terms. You are working within a framework that includes death as a permanent feature, and you are trying to make that framework more comfortable. And I understand the impulse, and it is not enough. It will never be enough, because every person you save from poverty today will still die. Every injustice you correct will be inherited by people who will also die. You are renovating a building that is structurally condemned and calling it progress." Tolstoy had no fully satisfying answer to this, and neither do I. Because Fedorov's theology of the unbearable demands that you take seriously the question of whether your acceptance of death is a moral position or a psychological coping mechanism that you've dressed up as a moral position. It demands that you examine the difference between wisdom and surrender, between maturity and defeat. We're very good at dressing this up. We've got thousands of years of practice. Every philosophical tradition that has grappled with mortality has produced some version of the same garment. Mortality is natural, therefore mortality is acceptable. Therefore making peace with mortality is wisdom. Therefore people who refuse to make peace with mortality are immature or deluded or failing to understand something important about the nature of existence. Fedorov understood something important about that argument. It's circular. Natural does not mean acceptable. Disease is natural. Starvation is natural. The suffering of children is natural. We do not look at those things and conclude that accepting them is wisdom. We look at them and conclude that fighting them is the definition of civilization. We built medicine to fight disease. We built agriculture to fight starvation. We called those projects progress. Fedorov called death the same kind of problem and proposed the same kind of response. And we've spent over a century finding increasingly sophisticated ways to explain why this particular natural catastrophe is different, why this one deserves our acceptance rather than our resistance, why the wisdom of maturity requires us to make peace with the thing that takes everyone we have ever loved and will eventually take us. He didn't find those explanations convincing. He found them familiar. He'd heard the structure of that argument before. It was the argument that said, some things are simply the way they are. Some erasures are simply the cost of existing in this world. Some people do not get to be returned to. Some losses are permanent, and the mature response is acceptance, and the immature response is to keep insisting that things could be otherwise. He'd been hearing that argument since 1829, and he'd never believed it. The theology of the unbearable is not comfortable theology. It does not offer you peace. It doesn't complete the deal that religion usually offers. Accept death, receive consolation. It tears the deal up. It hands you back your grief and your rage and your refusal, and it says, these are not weaknesses to be overcome. These are the beginning of the only serious response to the most serious problem. God showed you what was possible. Now stop praying and start working. The dead are waiting, and unlike you, they have no choice but to be patient. Brian Johnson is 48 years old, and he is spending millions of dollars trying to biologically reverse that number. He measures everything. He optimizes everything. He has the blood of his teenage son transfused into his body in a procedure that even his own medical team describes with some discomfort. He sleeps at the same time every night with the discipline of a monk. He eats a carefully calculated diet designed to extend his telomeres and reduce his inflammatory markers and push his biological age backward toward a number his calendar age will never match. He calls this Project Blueprint. He posts the results online. He has followers. He has imitators. He's inspired an entire ecosystem of biohackers and longevity researchers and people who believe that death is, as one prominent technologist put it, a bug rather than a feature. Nikolai Fedorov died in 1903. He would recognize every single one of them. Not with approval exactly, with the specific frustration of a man who watches people find the right problem and then solve it in entirely the wrong way. Because the longevity industry, the transhumanist movement, this Silicon Valley obsession with defeating death, all of it is Fedorovian in its premise and anti-Fedorovian in its execution. They found the target, but they've aimed at entirely the wrong thing. Fedorov's common task was universal or it was nothing. This was not a rhetorical flourish, it was the structural core of the philosophy. The resurrection of some people, the wealthy, the technologically connected, the people with access to the right clinics and the right supplements and the right blood transfusions, is not a step toward the common task. It is the opposite of the common task. It is the recreation in the domain of mortality of every hierarchy that has ever organized human suffering. It is the prince acknowledging some of his children and erasing the rest and calling the acknowledgement progress. Peter Thiel has funded longevity research extensively. Ray Kurzweil has spent decades predicting and preparing for the singularity, the moment when artificial intelligence surpasses human and, among other things, makes it possible to upload consciousness and achieve a kind of digital immortality. The language of Silicon Valley death defiance is saturated with the assumption that the people doing the defying are the relevant people, that the project is about extending the lives of those who can afford to extend them, and that this is good, and that the rising tide will eventually lift all boats, and that we should not be distracted from the main project by questions of distribution and access, and who gets to live longer in a world where some people still die of entirely preventable causes before they hit 40. And breathe. Fedorov would have had contempt for this. Not the contempt of a man who thinks the goal is wrong, the contempt of a man who thinks the goal is right and the execution is a moral catastrophe. The contempt of a man who looked at his own father and recognized the gesture. I will solve the problem for myself and for people like me, and I will call that a contribution to humanity. It is not a contribution to humanity, it is aristocracy with better branding. But here's where it gets complicated. Here's where Fedorov becomes not just a critic of the transhumanist project, but its most demanding examiner. Because the transhumanists are not wrong that death is a problem. They are not wrong that human intelligence and human technology might eventually be capable of addressing that problem in ways that previous generations could not imagine. They are not wrong that the acceptance of death as inevitable and sacred and beyond the reach of human agency is, at least in part, a psychological defense mechanism that we have elevated into philosophy. What they are wrong about is the scope and the ethics and what the project requires of the people doing it. And there's one group of Fedorov's descendants who were not wrong in this way, who took the common task seriously as a collective project, a universal project, one that demanded the reorganization of an entire civilization rather than the optimization of individual biology. The Soviet cosmists. Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, you already knew from the previous section, but he was a father of astronautics. He was the man who worked out the mathematics of rocket propulsion, the direct disciple who sat with Fedorov in Moscow and then spent his life making space travel theoretically possible. But the cosmist movement was much larger than Tsiolkovsky. Alexander Bogdanov, revolutionary, philosopher, science fiction writer, and founder of the world's first institution for blood transfusion research, God, I can really struggle saying that sentence, believed that the exchange of blood between people could extend life and create physiological solidarity between human beings. He died in 1928 conducting a blood transfusion experiment on himself, which is either the most cosmist death imaginable or a warning about the dangers of being too literal about your metaphors. Valerian Muravyov wrote about the mystery of time itself. Vladimir Vernadsky developed the concept of the noosphere, the idea that human thought constitutes a geological force, a layer of consciousness wrapped around the planet that is as real and as consequential as the atmosphere or the biosphere. These were not fringe figures. These were serious scientists and philosophers working in the early Soviet period, and their ideas fed directly into the ideology that made the Soviet space program not just a military and political project, but a genuinely utopian one. When Yuri Gagarin orbited the Earth in 1961, the official Soviet narrative was about communist achievement and technological superiority. But underneath that narrative, in the intellectual DNA of the engineers and theorists who made it possible, was Fedorov, the great librarian who gave his coat away and believed that humanity's destiny was among the stars not for adventure, but for obligation, not to plant a flag, but to build a home for the returned dead. the cosmos as cathedral, the rocket as resurrection machine. This is what gets lost when we tell the story of the space race as a story about geopolitics. It was also a story about what humanity believed it was for. And one answer to that question, an answer that ran through Russian intellectual life from Fedorov through the cosmists, through the engineers of the Soviet space program, was that humanity was for the defeat of death. That the purpose of consciousness was to refuse the conditions that consciousness had been born into. That intelligence, real intelligence, will eventually look at the universe's indifference to human life and decide, no, we are not going to accept this, we are going to change the terms. Gagarin looked down at Earth from orbit and said it was beautiful. Fedorov would have said, yes, and it is not enough. Look further, look at all that space, look at all that room, look at everything we could build out there if we stopped spending our capacity on killing each other and started spending it on the only project that justifies the existence of a species intelligent enough to conceive of it. And now here we are, 2026, the most technologically capable civilization in human history as far as I'm aware. We can edit genes, we can grow organs, we can train artificial intelligence on the sum total of human knowledge. We are, by any historical measure, closer to the kind of mastery over nature that Fedorov believed was the prerequisite for the common task than any generation before us. And we are using that capacity to help billionaires live longer. We're using it to optimize individual performance and extend individual lifespans and create individual digital legacies that will persist after individual deaths. And we're calling this progress. And Fedorov is in his library running his hands along the spines of books written by people who are gone and asking the same question he has always asked. Who is this for? The common task is for everyone or it's for no one. The defeat of death is universal or it's just another way of deciding whose existence is conditional and whose is not. Just another way of being the prince who acknowledges some children and erases the rest. The illegitimate son of a man who would not name him built a philosophy with no illegitimate children in it. Not one, anywhere, ever. That is the judgment Fedorov renders on the transhumanist project. Not that it's impossible, not that it's wrong to try, but that trying for yourself or for people like you, or for people who can afford to be tried for, that is not trying. That is the same old hierarchy just in a different outfit. The dead are not waiting for a better version of the same system that failed them. They're waiting for something that's never existed. A civilization serious enough to want all of them back. Nikolai Fedorov died on December 28, 1903. Pneumonia. A Moscow hospital. He had gone out in the cold without adequate clothing because someone else needed the clothing more, and the cold got into his chest and stayed there. And the man who spent his entire life arguing with death lost the argument the way all of us eventually lose it, quietly in a bed with unfinished work on the table. He was 74 years old. He had published nothing. He owned nothing. He left behind a trunk, some papers, and a philosophy so demanding that over a century later, we are still finding new ways to not be ready for it. Here's what you take with you. Not the science. The science may be impossible, or it may be the kind of impossible that becomes possible in 100 years the way flight was impossible and then wasn't. That argument belongs to physicists and engineers and people smarter than I am. What you take with you is the question underneath the science. What do you actually owe the dead? Not rhetorically. Not as the kind of question that dissolves comfortably into gratitude and memory in the occasional visit to a grave. As a moral question with weight and consequence and the capacity to indict you if you answer it honestly. The people who died before you, who suffered before you, who built before you, who loved before you and were erased before you. What is your actual obligation to them? Is memory enough? Is preservation enough? Is the library enough? Fedorov said no. You may disagree, but disagree seriously. Disagree the way the question deserves, which is with the full weight of what it is actually asking, not the comfortable, diminished version that lets you off the hook before you've even felt it. And then take this, the other thing, the thing that has nothing to do with resurrection and everything to do with right now. Fedorov was illegitimate, unnamed, born into a civilization that had a category for his kind of existence, and the category was conditional. He responded by building a philosophy in which no existence is ever conditional. in which the circumstances of your birth or your death or your social position cannot and do not determine whether you deserve to be returned to, whether you deserve to continue, whether you matter at all. Every person, ever, unconditionally. This is not a scientific proposal. That is a moral position. And it is one you can hold right now, today, without a lab or a rocket or some theory of particle reconstruction. You can decide that no existence is conditional, that no erasure is acceptable, that the comfortable agreement to let some people disappear quietly into poverty, into anonymity, into the categories civilization bills for people it finds inconvenient, is not maturity. It is collaboration. The librarian who slept on a trunk and gave away his coat and died of the cold knew the difference. The question is whether you do. If the idea that your peace with death might be collaboration rather than wisdom makes you want to just shut this off and go back to the comfortable grief you've already made your arrangements with, then good. That resistance is the settlement trying to protect itself from a question that might actually cost you something real. If you want to keep standing in the ruins with me, you can find the show in all the usual digital feeding troughs. We're on TikTok, Instagram and X, sporadically I will add, with the handle @TheObservingEye. And we're also on YouTube at youtube.com/@TheObservingEye as well. And then there's the Substack, which is our home base, at theobservingeye.com. Go there if you want the full transcripts, the deeper explorations and stuff that doesn't fit into the podcast because it requires you to sit with it. Completely ad-free, of course, because advertisements are just civilization's way of selling you comfort you didn't know you'd agreed to buy. Fuck adverts. Come and listen to it on Substack. It's much better. If something in this episode is making it harder to look at a library the same way, or harder to call your grief maturity, or harder to watch a billionaire fund his own immortality by using his son's blood, don't silence it. Join the conversation. Drop us a comment. Send a message. Fire an email into the digital void at david@theobservingeye.com. I am on the other end, slowly succumbing to entropy. And of course, if you want to support the show, don't just passively consume it. You can share it. You can hand it to someone whose carefully managed acceptance of death is quietly suffocating the part of them that knows acceptance and surrender are not always the same thing. As always, thank you, you beautiful lot, for listening. I deeply appreciate your time and your attention. And for those of you that keep coming back every week, my God, I must be doing something right. Fuck knows what it is. But thank you. I deeply appreciate it. Take care, everybody. Much love. And I'll catch you soon.